Thank you very much for the nice introduction. First and foremost, I'd like to extend my thanks to Cristiano Mazzei and his entire team, Yanbu, for this great organization. And secondly, I'd like to extend my thanks to Professor Moira Inghileri, with whom I am working. I believe I'm very lucky to have her right next to me as I continue my efforts to write this book. So what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to share the preliminary results of just some part of it. And before I do that, I would like to learn about your background so that I can set my tone accordingly as a conference interpreter. So are you practicing interpreters, or are you academicians or interpreting students? Could you please use the chat function and at least write about yourself, the reason why you are here today and what brought you here as I turn on the slides. Thank you very much. I'll be waiting as I share my screen. So we have students, interpreters, translators, language service coordinators. Thank you very much. Yeah. So today I will go into the first preliminary results of the research that I'm conducting at UMass Amherst, and the title is Exploring Remote Interpreting Through a Sociological Lens, Perspectives, Challenges, and Adaptations. I believe we have all had some challenges in adaptation to remote interpreting back in 2020. So that's why I will prefer to go into the way that we have adapted to remote settings, and it necessarily I will necessarily address the perspectives of the interpreters that I have talked to as well. First, I will go into my personal background, the reason why I am interested in exploring remote interpreting, then some theoretical background, but please bear with me. I won't go into the depths of habitus or illusio. I will give a cursory glance, which I hope will make sense. Then I will inform you about the methodology, study, preliminary conclusions, and the future directions, because I'd like to connect it with the previous seminars as well. That's why I think it's important to have a look at the future directions. Well, the reason why I'm interested in this study has to do with my professional and academic trajectory, in the sense that I'm a professional conference interpreter. I've been doing this job for more than 15 years, and it was in March 2020 that suddenly we found out that we could no longer work in the booths, which we were very much accustomed to. Therefore, we experienced what Bourdieu would call disruption of habitus, in the sense that we were literally at home, but we were not at home. We were not in our familiar places. We were no longer in the booth, somewhere back in the room, in our little nests or cocoons, but we were literally at home. On the left-hand side is a picture of mine from a real, I still call it real. Can you believe that? Real setting, physical setting. And on the right-hand side, as you may see, I have two computers in front of me, the headset. What you may not see in this picture is an Ethernet cable, of course. So we suddenly found ourselves at home, and our habitus was somehow disrupted. When we have a look at the literature, the remote interpreting literature, pre-COVID literature mostly addresses the difficulties, apart from a couple of studies, of course, such as Killian Zeber's and Sabine Brown's studies. The difficulties surrounding remote interpreting were non-presence and its effects on early set of fatigue, concentration and motivation, lack of concentration and motivation, exclusion of interpreters from taking practical decisions. And however, post-COVID literature mostly investigates the way that we have adapted to remote settings. Well, of course, it is worthwhile to mention the AIC Task Force on Distance Interpreting Guidelines. I was also a member of the Task Force on Distance Interpreting Guidelines in my national and local Conference Interpreting Association, TKTD. So I believe we followed suit of AIC in preparing the local guidelines, and I would argue that they have become very, very helpful. Then, especially in 2022, the number of studies tackling remote interpreting have increased, such as Corpus and Pastor 2022 and Buhan and Collard 2022, tackling the ways in which the interpreters have interacted with technology. Well, I see a couple of familiar faces in here, so I would like to refer to their research as well. I see my dear friend Zeynep Şengel. She also tackled the way that interpreters have addressed the difficulties, particularly in Zoom. And I see Şeyda. She also has made extensive research on remote interpreting. And we have Esther Debeu. Excuse me, Esther, if I mispronounce your surname, but I know that your recent book around remote interpreting has just been published by Routledge. So in addition to these names, there are more and more ongoing studies addressing remote interpreting and the way that we have adapted to remote settings. However, there's a certain gap in the literature in the sense that Hoyt West asking whether the interpreters, the conference interpreters, would no longer be called elites, believes that there is a certain gap in the literature in the sense that we need a strong, there's a strong need, or we need additional sociologically based studies on of the conference interpreting profession as it continues to evolve in the post-pandemic world. And according to Fontenot, the perspective of human-centric evaluation seems to be the missing link. Further, Sabine Brown argues that video remote interpreting is a socially constructed practice rather than simply a result of technological evolution. Now that we have gone into literature, the remote interpreting literature, why don't we continue with a small piece from real literature? Well, my dear friend Pınar Köprücü suggested that I read this book, and I truly enjoyed the experience, and I'd like to quote from that, because I believe it may capture the elite stance of conference interpreters. Yet again, it's kind of exaggerated. Well, let me give you some background information. The main character in this book is a conference interpreter, and there is a small excerpt in which he goes into the differences between translators and interpreters, and let us see how he depicts interpreters. Well, for Marias, Javier Marias, interpreters think of themselves as, let me pull it that way so that I can read that. Interpreters think of themselves as being some kind of demigod or demidiva. I am very much curious as to whether you agree with him or not. Simply because they are on view to politicians and representatives and deputy delegates who live only for them. As I told you, it's kind of exaggerated. Yet again, please bear with me. Or rather, for their presence and the work that they do. There is no denying that they are on view to the world's leaders, which is why they are so impeccably turned out. Dressed up to the nines. Well, we may sometimes be dressed up to the nines, and it's not uncommon to glimpse them through the glass walls of their booths, applying lipstick. Well, do we sometimes do that? I'm not so sure, but let's continue. And combing their hair, kind of exaggerated, adjusting the knot of a tie, plucking out hairs with tweezers, no way, and brushing off specks of dust from their suit or trimming their sideburns. They always have a vanity mirror to hand. Well, I find it kind of exaggerated. Yet again, it gives us a sense as to the ways that interpreters have been depicted even in literature. I mean, what I'm talking about is conference interpreters. So let me make a certain distinction. The research question that I plan to address for this talk is, could habitus as a theoretical lens help us gain insight into the way interpreters experienced or shaped remote interpreting? The reason why I chose habitus in my research has to do with the fact that, according to Moncrieff, Bourdieu accounts for the tensions and contradictions that arise when people encounter and are challenged by different contexts. That's why I thought habitus could help us to gain insight into the way that we experienced disruption of habitus back in 2020 and in the continuation of it. And my understanding of remote interpreting in this research has to do with video conference interpreting and video remote interpreting as defined by AIC. So when I say remote interpreting, I mean video conference interpreting and video remote interpreting in this talk. The results of my research around the gendered approaches to remote interpreting are to be published soon in the book edited by my dear friend Esther Monzo-Nebot and Vicenta Tasafuster, in the book Gendered Technology in Translation and Interpreting, Centering Rights in the Development of Language Technologies, and it is to be published by Routledge soon. So if you are interested, you may read the gendered approaches to remote interpreting, a booth of one's own. Well, of course, I was inspired by Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own in penning this book chapter. Well, here comes the theory, but as I told you, I won't go into the depths of it, so I'll try to make it as understandable as possible, and I will go into illusio and habitus in this talk. So, illusio has been coined by Bourdieu, and in coining the term, he was inspired by homo ludens, meaning that we are all playing beings, playing human beings. Because we play games, we abide by the rules. Sometimes there are sanctions if we do not abide by the rules, such as the associations of which we are members, right? If we do not abide by the rules of those associations, there are some ethical implications. So for Bourdieu, illusio is a fundamental belief in the interests of the game. So we are all, I assume that we are all playing the game of interpreting and the value of stakes, which is inherent in membership of any field. So we are all in the field of interpreting, and we believe in the interests of the game. Let me continue. According to him, illusio constitutes the field as the space of a game, and partaking in illusio requires taking seriously the stakes which arise from the logic of games, although such a seriousness may seem inconsequential for people engaged in other fields. Let me give you an example, and let me tell you the reason why I have the picture of Julia Pöger, who was kind enough to fly all the way to Istanbul and to offer us a training back in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So it was in the early days of the pandemic that I joined one of the social gatherings organized by Julia Pöger for the people who have joined her Know Your Word seminars. And well, I joined the meeting through Zoom. My husband was with me. He comes from a different field, the field of finance. He's a finance professor. And here we were talking about our headsets, the microphones, the Yeti microphones, or the Ethernet cables, this and that. And he was like, what are you doing? Because it seems inconsequential for him. What we are doing does not make sense for him. However, what we were doing had to do with the fact that we were there and we attempted to invest in our field to be able to sustain our profession, to be able to continue interpreting in this remote world. So it was very, very important for us. Because for us, for interpreters, joining the seminar, making such investments is a way of being in the world, being occupied by the world, enabling us to be impacted by something very distant to the extent that it is part of the game in which we participate. Secondly, I would like to go into habitus, because habitus, according to Bourdieu, contributes to understanding the field as a meaningful world, a world endowed with sense and value, in which it is investing one's energy. So we were there joining all those online seminars, joining all those online meetings, because we wanted to invest our energy into remote interpreting. We wanted to be there. There are two elements that come into place when we talk about habitus. One is exposition. For Bourdieu, coining this term, we are disposed because we are exposed. Well, let me give you a very, very brief example. It was yesterday that I was working on my presentation and I went to Barnes and Noble, a bookstore, and there I met a friend of mine. Well, we worked for the same company, I guess it was 15 years ago, and I showed him my slides and he told me, well, I think you should do your slides more appealing, and you should do this, you should do that, because he still works for a company. He's a marketing person. He's having his MBA at UMass Amherst, whereas I am a conference interpreter and an academician. So it is clear that we don't share the same habitus anymore, because since I have been exposed to interpreting for 15 years, since I am working as an academician, I have been exposed to an academic field, and it has changed who I am. So for Bourdieu, exposition is highly important in gaining a certain habitus. And it is the way, I mean, habitus means the way the society becomes deposited in persons in the form of lasting dispositions or trained capacities and structured propensities to think, feel, and act in determinate ways, which then guide them. And time is the second crucial point in understanding habitus, because it's only through a certain period of time that we become accustomed to doing things, right? So for him, dispositions that are shaped by past events and that shape current practices and structures, and also importantly, they condition our very perceptions of these. So we acquire these dispositions in time. As I told you, I've been a conference interpreter for 15 years, and it means that I have acquired a certain cultural capital, a certain social capital, and I'm sure it holds true for all of us because we have been in this world for a long time. And however, my understanding of habitus is not a static one. It does not mean that we are trapped inside ourselves. No, according to Bourdieu, there is a continuous restructuring, meaning that what we gain in school, what we gain in family first, structures our experiences at the school. And then the school experiences, I mean, if you have studied translation and interpreting, it is clear that this training you have acquired in translation and interpreting schools or departments will structure your subsequent experiences. Therefore, I agree, my understanding of habitus aligns with the understanding of Inghileri in the sense that it offers us it gives us an alternative to viewing interpreters forever trapped inside our socially constituted self. So I believe that habitus, as noted by Bourdieu in his recent work, habitus is a dynamic concept, not a static one. Well, I use the term habitus. However, you may see the traces of it even in popular books, such as the recent book that I read by Gabor Mate, The Myth of Normal. What it tells us is that prior to becoming creators of our environment, we are its creation. So we are created by the environment before we attempt to shape it. Before we develop the capacity to take part in constructing our universe, the world fashions us, according to Gabor Mate. The Myth of Normal is a bestseller nowadays, so I highly recommend that you read it. I loved reading it, I must admit. Accordingly, I would argue that as interpreters, we are caught up and absorbed in the game of interpreting, despite divergences and convergences. And what causes these divergences and convergences has to do with the years that we have spent in the profession. This is what I'm trying to display in my research. And here are two pictures from the booth. Well, I found those pictures on my Instagram account. I must admit, I'm not good at keeping pictures, but thank God I used Instagram and kept those pictures there. So it shows the good old days where we were in the booths prior to pandemic, but we're still back to the booths. Most of us, I believe, still do physical interpreting. My description of remote interpreting, let me go into my description of remote interpreting. In this study, the interpreters are considered to be the agents who, because of their previous investments, because of the fact that we have been in the booths for a long time, are inclined to be interested in it and endowed with the aptitudes to activate it. I will show you what I mean through the examples, so please bear with me. And according to Bourdieu, the practices operationalized by habitus are the strategy generating principles, and they enable the agents to cope with the unpredicted cases. That's why I use habitus in my research. As such, the past conditions shape the way we, interpreters, agents, tackle unforeseen cases. And in my research, the interpreters are considered to be the agents bearing the traces of the social structure in which they have dwelled for a very long time. However, as I told you, there are some divergences and convergences in the sense that I grouped my participants into three. The interpreters who have 30 years of experience, the interpreters who have 10 to 30 years of experiences, and the interpreters who have less than 5 years of experiences. Because what the data tells me is that you can easily see the differences between the approaches of the interpreters based on the cultural capital they have accumulated or not accumulated over the years, and the social capital. That's why I grouped my interviewees into three. And as for the design and methods, it's an exploratory qualitative and quantitative research. Well, I will not go into the quantitative part of it. I will go into the qualitative part today. I conducted semi-structured interviews with 26 freelance conference interpreters, all members of the association, except the ones who have less than 5 years of experiences. And I conducted these interviews between June 5th, 2022 and September 10th, 2023. I anonymized the data. I use Otter AI in auto transcription. Then, of course, I manually checked the data, coded it on MaxQDA, and conducted the thematic analysis based on the repetition and recurrence. And I derived the themes accordingly. And then I aligned the data with theory. This research is both historical and sociological in the sense that I addressed the ways that interpreters adapted to remote settings in 2020. And then in 2021, we had hybrid meetings. And with the onset of 2022, there was an uptick in physical meetings. So we have both remote and physical meetings in our lives. That's why it's both a historical and sociological research. And the part that I'm going to present today has to do with the way that we have adapted to remote settings in 2020. So I won't cover the entire research in here. So I call it dispositions exposed in transition to remote because as noted by Rain Meylaerts, interviews help us to expose dispositions in sociological research. So what I found out is that the interpreters have a tendency to reenact the booth experience, although in remote settings, particularly in 2020. And they wanted to reenact collegiality. They had an affinity for coffee. It's not just coffee. It represents, I mean, it goes more beyond that. So it has to do with the entire booth experiences, as we will see in the data, at least some parts of it, and the outfit. But they all have to do with this little cocoon or with this comfort that we would like to preserve. So booth for interpreters is like a little cocoon. It's like a nest. It represents safeness and comfort. Think of it. We are in the back of the hall interpreting, and we're not using multiple devices. Nobody disturbs us. We're just doing our work. So that's why they wanted to create a similar experience at home. That's why booth was like a yardstick for them. And I'd like to, now what I will do is that I will give you I will share some excerpts from the data. And I believe this excerpt is very much telling in the sense that it captures such a yearning for the booth and the collegiality. Well, let me read it for you. I like the booth experience as a whole, interpreter 10 argues. To me, it's like my workspace. It's like my office and the interpreter sitting next to me. But my boothmate is my coworker practically. And I interact with that person on so many different levels. First, thoughtfully, because you come into the booth in the morning, you say, hi, good morning. You must probably have worked with that person before. At least in my case, that's the situation. You just say, oh, I haven't seen you for a while. So how is everything about your daughter's school? This and that. Well, uh, the data was, the excerpt was even longer, so I tried to shorten it. I always learned from interpreters. Conference interpreters are extremely knowledgeable people, extremely resourceful people, well-traveled people. So I always learn from my colleagues, not only during the meeting, but also during the interaction while interpreting, also on the margins of the meeting, during our conversations at a social level as well. So that's one thing I'm missing in remote interpreting, interpreter 10 maintains. And accordingly, now that we have yearned for a booth, we try to create a booth at home, despite being at home, right? We try to be in our safe place because it was where we used to work previously. And it was what we have become accustomed to over the years that we spent in the profession. I found this picture on the right-hand side, again, in my Instagram account, and apparently I called it homemade booth. I was very surprised when I found those pictures because those pictures apparently fit what the data tells us. So let me begin. For interpreter 8, they are just discovering ways to make it feel close to the physical booths as much as possible. That's how we created those remote settings at home. For interpreter 7, it's a comfort zone. And for interpreter 15, it's a sacred place. Can you believe it's a sacred place? Because you are there, you are with your boothmate, and it's your habitus in a way. Interpreter 9 puts it as follows. It was very difficult for me to work remotely during the pandemic because I have to put my head into something. Can you believe that when it's open air, we just can't concentrate? So I needed something confined, like a booth. Having this open space all around me, actually, I could not concentrate, she goes on. And interpreter 14 argues that, interpreter 14 believes that what they did was to pretend that they were actually here in a conference setting. And that's how she became accustomed to interpreting at home. Interpreter 22, well, while mentioning an experience, I asked this interpreter about their experience in 2022. Because when they went back to the physical settings, what happened and how did they feel and how was the experience? And this is what they have told me. Shall I call it home? But I feel like I was returning to the familiar place that I loved and cherished so much. It was like seeing an old friend. The feeling was exactly like seeing an old friend. That box. These excerpts suggest that the meaning attributed to booth goes beyond the literal sense of the word. So it has a certain emotional, we as interpreters have a certain emotional connection to the booth, and we would like to reenact the booth experience despite being at home back in 2020. I will proceed with collegiality. And before I do that, I'm going to have some water, and maybe you may use the chat function and share about your experience as well, so that it's going to be a more interactive session if you would like to, as practicing interpreters. Did you have the same experience? If you have any remarks, please feel free to share. Interesting. I can see the chat box. Okay, let me continue. Then we will have a more interactive Q&A session then. I will proceed with collegiality because each time the term booth came up in my data, it was accompanied by boothmate. We wanted to connect with our boothmates despite being at home. Well, I believe there are some certain differences in the sense that, for instance, if you work in Spanish-English language combination, it is clear that you have met more and more people in remote settings. But if you work in minority languages, there's not much chance that you will meet hundreds of new colleagues or some other colleagues out there. So it has to do with the market as well. Let me see. Dressing up for physical versus down for remote, Alexander Etlin says. Okay, we will see that, Alexander. But I believe in the early days of the pandemic, it was just the reverse. That's what my data tells. Yet again, there are some gender-related differences. It's mostly women who did that, right? Anyway, let's continue. Dispositions exposed. So now I will go into collegiality, and this is what interpreter 3 mentions. I think I can concentrate more when I'm in a physical booth with a colleague. As I told you, each time booth came up, it was accompanied by the term colleague. So we would like to create a booth-like experience, but we would like to have we would like to share this experience with our colleagues. We would like them to be by our side. I like being in the booth. I like the interaction with my booth mates, interpreter 9 holds. There are several interpreters in my data who have told me that they use WhatsApp videos to interact with booth mates because it creates a more booth-like atmosphere. This is how interpreter 21 defines it. And I see Zeynep nodding her head. So yes, that's what I did too. But it has to do with the setting that we work for, of course. Our back channel was always WhatsApp video calls, and we always saw each other. When I do this on the WhatsApp video, I call my colleague and they notice their turns. It's that natural. And I see their face. I see it when they don't understand. They can look at me and get an approval from me. I know. And they know they have understood correctly because I was listening to them and they don't need to feel like they are left alone. Let's get back to the literature, remote interpreting literature that was penned prior to COVID. Isolation was one of the major issues, and apparently that's how we attempted to solve it out. We no longer wanted to feel isolated as interpreters, and WhatsApp calls helped us, though at the expense of controlling multiple devices. According to her, what she carried to remote settings from physical settings was the cooperative style, human touch, and solidarity. That's how she defined it. And I find it quite useful because this is what has come up in many instances in my data. It's the same case for interpreter 11 because she holds that if you already have a rapport or something like that with your colleague, if you're like friends, you're going to be used to how they work and they're going to be used to how you work. So you will understand from their body language. So we are still looking for some clues. You remember in the pre-COVID literature, again, non-presence, lack of body language related cues was a problem. And here we are trying to solve it out as interpreters. So you can tell whether they are struggling with a certain speaker, with a certain term, or with a certain expression. And as I told you, coffee is not just, the definition of coffee for interpreters goes beyond that. There was one particular interpreter who referred to coffee. And then what he told me was like, the interpreters love coffee. I know that, but I'm not one of them. Instead of I go 40. So it was very, very interesting for me that all those coffee, tea, beverages came up in my data because I did not ask them about that. So it just came up in the data, which was quite surprising. And well, it was, I believe each and every research has a life of its own. It guides you to certain directions. And this is where it guided me. I was very, very surprised because for interpreters, the meaning of coffee has to do with creating a booth-like atmosphere again. It has to do with the social and emotional ties with the colleagues sitting right next to them, or with the little breaks in which we go out and become visible. So that's why coffee was a term that came up very, very frequently in my data. I was very much surprised, as I told you. And then I found those pictures on the left-hand side. I also had some pictures with the coffee, apparently, be it Starbucks or Turkish coffee. Anyway, so what interpreter 7 tells me is, I look forward to coffee breaks. And it's very interesting in the sense that she told me normally she would not search for coffee in physical settings, but here she is at home and looking forward to coffee breaks. I'm on my own. That doesn't make too much difference. You know, it's interesting. It's a psychological thing. So she expresses it very, very clearly. Affinity for coffee is something psychological and social, I believe. As soon as there is a coffee break, I have to go and make myself a coffee. I have to go. So she underscores that she has to go. She underscores it twice. For another interpreter, interpreter 12, they do those things which help them a lot, like getting the coffee, like they do it on a regular day. So what we're trying to do at home is trying to create a regular work day, right? So we have a certain outfit, and then we have our coffee, we create a WhatsApp-like a video atmosphere, and we try to enact or reenact the booth experience in its entirety. I try to do those things to sort of support the preparation. So coffee supports the preparation, the mental preparation. It helps them get into the mood. So it's the part of the mental preparation. And another interpreter puts it as follows. I feel like I'm losing my connection to the job, sometimes because I feel more isolated, more away from the people, from my booth mates. So even before the assignments, I have to connect with him or her. Sometimes we have coffee together. And I also had the same experience in the sense that whenever we turned on the WhatsApp, if we are interpreting on Zoom, we would turn on the WhatsApp and we would ask each other as to whether we had our coffee. So coffee, in a way, connected us, although we were in separate homes during the early days of the COVID. Well, I believe things have changed, and this is what my data tells me. I'm talking about the early days of COVID in this particular presentation. However, things have changed. This is what the data tells me. And we are more accustomed. We are more self-confident in remote settings. And all those items that helped us in the early days of the COVID may or may not hold true nowadays. So it's just the way that we got accustomed. But things have changed immensely, right? And outfits. For Bourdieu, objectified history becomes activated and more or less institutionalized position with the more or less codified program of action that it contains. Like a garment, a tool, a book, or a house. Someone who sees in it enough of themselves and make it their own, and by the same token are taken up by it. What he tells us is that waiters, for instance, personal history aligns with his role as he dons his black trousers and white jacket. And for him, it cannot even be said that he takes himself for a waiter. He is too completely taken up by the job to which he was sociologically destined. And just like a waiter, what the data suggests is that we have also used outfits to align with our role in the early days of the pandemic as conference interpreters. And here are some examples. What interpreter 5 told me was she found ways of focusing because it was very distracting in the early days of the COVID. Well, distraction was one of the terms that came up very, very frequently in my data related to the early days of the pandemic. But as I told you, things have changed immensely. Now we have become much more accustomed. However, for her, outfit was a way of focusing. So outfit is not an outfit per se. It's not like the physical days. Then I found ways of focusing, one of which was what I learned from our colleague. She said that she dressed up really as if she would go in. As you may see, we're still pretending to be in the booth. It looks as if we are still in the booth, though we are not. She was going to the venue, and she will also put on her makeup and sit in front of Zoom at home. So I said, okay, let me try this, because I've not really had I mean, I'm having hard time concentrated and I haven't concentrated enough. So I did that for a while, but please be careful in the sense that she did that for a while. It doesn't hold true anymore. So those are the elements that helped us in the transition in 2020. And interpreter 4 told me that she still does her makeup and she still has a nice top or whatever, just in case. Like when I'm scared that they're going to ask me to turn on the camera. They normally don't. And just in case, I don't want them to see my messy hair, no makeup or whatever. So I dress up still. And that's mostly to kind of get me into my role, basically. So just like I mean, supporting Bourdieu's argument in the sense that outfit helps us to get into the role, this interpreter told me that outfit is a tool, an instrument that helps her to get into the role of a professional interpreter. It's not an outfit per se. I mean, the description of outfit goes beyond the literal definition. And interpreter 8 puts it as follows. I guess that dressing kind of brings you the feeling that I'm at work, or it helps our brain to adapt and switch from home to work. So it's a tool in this sense. And let me proceed with the conclusions. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments as practicing interpreters, academicians, the way that you have experienced the remote settings and what has helped you. And I will also go into the reason why I make such a research, because it may help us for the future. So what the data suggests is that we invested in adjusting our brains, our roles into remote settings. And we had a collective feel for the game as conference interpreters. Well, let me make a distinction. I believe AIC, TKTD, all those associations also helped us to sense this collective feel for the game. And since conference interpreting is a more structured field, we were supported by our teammates, by the associations, and we believed that we could make the right investment into our profession and ourselves. So the data illustrates that, or the data shows that the materiality of interpreting has been inscribed in interpreters' bodies and minds through affinity for the booth, boothmate, coffee, and outfit. Therefore, boothmates, coffee, and outfit have enabled the adaptation of interpreters to remote settings as emotional structures, because you can also sense the emotions behind all those statements. They yearn for the booth. That's why they try to create a booth-like atmosphere despite being at home. And therefore, we are both structured by our previous experiences as conference interpreters, and we structure our remote interpreting experiences. In a way, booth has served as a yardstick against which interpreters have measured their remote interpreting settings. So we may have asked ourselves, to what extent does my homemade booth resemble a real booth, so that I can begin working in such a setting? Sarah Ahmed argues that emotions stick and circulate with objects. So Booth, drawing on her arguments, I believe that Booth has been sticky, or has served as a stick in transition to remote interpreting, and it has helped us to get accustomed to remote interpreting settings. Further, the disposition toward the booth, shaped by our emotional habitus, is reinforced and strengthened in our advertent and non-advertent attempts to get closer to a booth-like experience in perpetuating interpreting in remote settings. So we have reinforced and strengthened our habitus in this sense. And the reason why I would like to go into 2020 today has to do with the practical implications, because now we are faced with AI, right? It's going to be the new reality in our profession, both in academia and both in interpreting field. And this is what interpreter 25 told me. Well, I'm going to quote, let me quote what he shared. Now, I kind of think that, you know, as everybody was upset during the pandemic about remote simultaneous interpreting, and everybody was worried about this and this and that, it was kind of like AI was sneaking upon us, like, oh yeah, you think you're concerned now? Wait until you see me. So now Pandora's box is open. We had remote in the past, and now we have AI. So what are we going to do with AI? What are we going to do? I mean, which habits of us or which dispositions are we going to carry to AI settings? Because as mentioned by the previous speaker, dear Professor Franz Pöhecker, we will have to find ways to work with AI. We may even become post editors. This is what he mentioned in the previous webinar. So it is clear, as it has been mentioned several times by the other participants, including Fantunuoli, we have to find ways to work with AI. So we can't put it back to the box. That's why I put this picture representing Pandora's box. Now the box is open. Now we're going to have to find ways to work with AI and to accept its presence. And it is time to investigate how we can adapt to this new setting. Remote is something in the past. I mean, we tried to adapt to that, and I think we did a really, really good job. I don't know as to whether you agree with me, but most of us were very good. Of course, there are some differences based on the years that we have spent. Some elder interpreters felt like they had to quit the profession. I also interviewed them, and they told me what forced them, and it had to do mainly with not being there. They felt isolated. They felt like they couldn't create the booth atmosphere at home, and that's why they left. Now it is time to benefit from our experience of remote interpreting, and if possible, transfer all our learnings to AI settings. As noted by Cronin, who is one of my favorite translation scholars, the relationship between translators and tools is the decisive element in the evolution of translation, rather than the connection between translators and text. So now it is time to look into the relationship between translators and tools. That's why I believe conducting such a research may help us enlighten the future attempts. And if you are interested, my humble suggestion to you would be to watch dear Barry Olson's video, Pro Interpreters versus AI Challenge, who translates faster and better. It was screened in Wired, I believe, a couple of months ago. And I think it's really important to come together, just like we did in the early days of the pandemic, as conference interpreters, as interpreters, including community interpreters, and in which field you work, and to tackle AI-related challenges together and to draw on our habitus. And last but not least, a quick reminder. Habitus can shift in relation to specific contexts and over time. As I told you, we need time for habitus to shift. We have been interpreting in remote settings for 3 years. Well, it may not be enough time. However, what the data tells me is that things have shifted in the sense that we no longer need those outfits. Most of us do not need that. We feel more confident and we tend to go for shorter turns. Well, let me leave you with those ideas in mind and those thoughts to ponder on. And I kindly ask Jan to share the link to this Wired video, Pro Interpreters versus AI Challenge. Who translates faster and better? I think it gives us a very good sense of what is happening in the AI world, which is what we have to do nowadays. Thank you. Muchas gracias and teşekkürler. Well, these are my only working languages, so that's why if we have participants from the other nations, the languages, that's all I can do. Thank you. Muchas gracias and teşekkürler.